The prairie dawn broke slow and deliberate, like an old hand spreading the last glowing coals of a fire across a wide gray sky. A chill wind wandered through the grass, carried with the faint, metallic scent of a storm long past, and the quiet creak of boards came from a cabin that seemed stitched together by little more than stubbornness and prayer. Inside, Clara Mae Whitfield stirred the pot of thin broth that had been stretched too far already, her shoulders hunched beneath a shawl worn as threadbare as the curtains drooping in the single window. She had once been Clara Mae Whitfield, wife of a miner with a laugh that filled rooms and the kind of hands that worked themselves bloody to build a home. Now, in the townsfolk's whispers, she was poor Clara, pitted, scorned, or simply forgotten depending on who was doing the whispering. Her husband had been buried beneath a mountain of rock 3 winters ago, and she had not buried her hunger since. 2 children, Tommy and Rose, were the only bright flame left to her, though even their laughter came softer these days, dulled by the ache of empty stomachs. Tommy, 10 years old and restless with the spirit of his father, busied himself near the door, whittling a scrap of wood into something that might resemble a horse if one squinted kindly. Rose, younger by 3 years, hummed to herself while stitching a patch into a corner of a blanket that had been mended so often it seemed more patches than cloth. They were children of want, and yet Clara's heart swelled with pride she would not speak aloud. Their small hands never complained. Their eyes still held sparks of wonder even when nights were long and suppers short. It was Tommy who first heard it, that faint rasp carried through the door like a breath cut too shallow. He stilled, knife hovering over the wood, and cocked his head toward the sound. Another gasp followed, weak and wet, the sound of life clinging by its fingernails. Clara, startled, set down the ladle and rose to her feet, her worn shoes making no sound on the warped floorboards. She lifted the latch and opened the door, just wide enough to let the gray light spill across the dirt. There in the yard, half sprawled against the broken fence post, lay a man. His hat had rolled aside, his face shadowed beneath hair clotted with dust and blood. A torn sleeve revealed skin burned by sun, and gashed by something sharper than stone. He shifted weakly when the door opened, one hand trembling as at the wave, though no words followed. Tommy rushed forward, but Clara caught his shoulder. Fear pulsed in her veins, the kind that came from too many nights alone, where every stranger carried the weight of a possible threat. She scanned the horizon, half expecting a posse or outlaws, but there was only the hush of prairie wind. Slowly, with a kind of weariness that felt older than her years, she stepped down the porch and knelt beside the man. His lips were cracked, his breath ragged, his pulse a thin flutter beneath her fingertips. "Mama," Rose's voice quivered from the doorway. "He's gonna die if we leave him there." Clara pressed her hand to the man's chest. She could feel the rise and fall, faint but real. Her mind argued with her heart. She had little food, less medicine, no time for another mouth to feed, no space for danger. Yet the memory of her husband's last day rose sharp within her. The way men had told her he gasped under the rubble, waiting, hoping, needing, and no hand had been near enough to save him. Mercy had not reached him, but perhaps it could reach this stranger. "Help me lift him," she said at last. The children obeyed without question, Tommy tugging at one arm, Rose holding the fallen hat and staring at the stranger's face with wide, solemn eyes. Together, they dragged him into the cabin, laying him on the cot opposite the hearth. The fire was little more than embers, but Clara coaxed it back with careful hands, setting the light against the man's pallor. His shirt was torn, chest streaked with blood both dried and fresh, and Clara knew she would need to clean the wounds if he had any chance at all. From a small box hidden beneath her bed, she withdrew a few strips of cloth, a tiny bottle of whiskey kept for sickness, and a needle threaded with coarse string. Her hands trembled as she worked, but steadiness came from desperation, the way it always did. She cleaned, stitched, and bound him, whispering prayers under her breath. Rose knelt at her side, holding the basin steady, while Tommy fetched more water from the bucket outside, his face set with quiet determination. Hours passed in this way, the cabin filled with the smell of smoke, iron, and whiskey. Clara paused at last, sitting back on her heels, and studied the stranger's face. Beneath the grime and wounds, there was a hardness etched there. A man seasoned by the trail, no doubt. His jaw was strong, but slack with fever, his skin pale beneath the tan. He stirred once, murmuring something she could not catch, and his eyes cracked open for bare a second before sliding shut again. Clara's heart clenched. She did not want him here, not truly. He was a weight upon her fragile balance, a question she could not answer. Yet she could not bring herself to cast him back into the dust either. Mercy was costly, but to deny it felt heavier still. By nightfall, the children slept curled together on their blanket, their breaths soft against the silence. Clara sat by the cot, staring at the rise and fall of the stranger's chest. The firelight flickered over the walls, making ghosts out of shadows. She thought of the town, of the way they would sneer if they knew. Clara Mae took in a drifter. Fool woman, desperate enough to lay kindness at the feet of a stranger. The gossip would sting, as it always had. But tonight, she was not thinking of them. Tonight, she was thinking of the fragile thread between life and death, and of the chance to tip the scale. Her head bent, her hands folded together, and she whispered into fire, "Lord, don't make me regret this." The stranger shifted in his sleep then, a faint groan pressing past his lips, as though he had heard her plea. Clara startled, her pulse quickening, then drew the blanket up to his shoulders. The storm outside had settled into stillness, but inside her heart a different storm was gathering, one of doubt, of fear, of questions yet unanswered. The cabin grew quiet, save for the pop of wood in the hearth and the sigh of the wind pressing against the boards. In that quiet, Clara realized she had stepped across a line. Her world, as fragile and narrow as it had been, was no longer hers alone. She had opened her door to a wounded man, and whatever he carried, sorrow, danger, or deliverance, was now entwined with hers. Her eyes lingered on his face, and she knew sleep would not come easy tonight. She had made a choice, and choices had a way of remaking the road ahead. She only prayed that when dawn came again, she would not find herself wishing she had closed the door instead. The days that followed unspooled slowly, like thread tugged from a fraying hem, each hour measured by the stranger's shallow breaths and the scrape of Clara's chair across the floor as she rose and sat again, unable to keep still. The children tended to him in their small ways. Tommy carving a thin stick into something resembling a toy and setting it by the cot, Rose smoothing his hair back from his fevered brow with a damp cloth. Their innocence softened the heaviness of the room, though Clara's heart never allowed her to forget the truth. He was still a stranger, and strangers could be both salvation and ruin. The town did not wait long before its whispers drifted up to the cabin like smoke from a far-off fire. Clara felt their judgment even before she heard the words. When she walked into town with her sewing basket, the hush that fell on certain corners was enough to chill her bones. One woman remarked, not quietly, that it was no wonder Clara's curtains were always drawn now, with a man hidden inside. Another sniffed and said poor women grew desperate in ways that shame a church pew. Clara lowered her eyes and moved quickly, but the sting lodged in her chest. She carried back bread and beans, but also the weight of 100 sidelong glances. Back in the cabin, she tried to shake it off. The stranger, Eli, as she learned one afternoon when his fever broke enough for him to murmur his name, was gaining strength. His voice was rough, words clipped, but there was something steady beneath the weakness. He thanked her in the simplest way a man could, his gaze meeting hers without decoration, and she felt both startled and unsettled by the quiet intensity of it. She told him not to speak, only to rest, though her hands trembled as she wrung out the cloth for his forehead. Each day he sat up a little longer, his shoulders squared as though refusing to bow to weakness. Tommy perched nearby, wide-eyed, eager to hear anything of the trail. Eli said little, but once he showed the boy how to steady a knife against a grain of wood, guiding his small hands with patient care. Rose watched with solemn fascination, clutching her patched blanket to her chest as though memorizing every gesture. Clara, sewing at the table, let her eyes linger longer than she meant to, wondering at the tenderness hidden inside a man who looked so weather-worn. But the gossip pressed harder. At church, the pew behind hers rustled with whispered remarks, and Clara felt her face burn though no one spoke to her directly. Her dignity bent under the weight, but she kept her spine straight, refusing to let them see her falter. When the hymn rose, she sang softer than she once had, but she sang all the same. Returning home, she found herself walking faster, her basket clutched tight, as though every word spoken behind her back had followed her into the dust. That evening, Eli caught her watching the children as they slept. He had risen to sit by the fire, shadows sharp against his jaw, and his voice was low when he said, "You've given me more than I deserve." She almost asked what he meant, but the words died in her throat. Something in his tone made her afraid of the answer, so she turned away, fussing with the pot as though soup could erase what she'd heard. The next night brought rain. It hammered the roof in relentless rhythm, seeping through a crack near the hearth. Clara scrambled to place a pot beneath the drip, muttering under her breath. Eli rose despite his weakness and steadied the beam that sagged, his arms trembling but unyielding. She stepped beside him to help, their shoulders brushing in the dim light. For a breathless moment, the closeness silenced the storm, though the words that might have filled the space between them remained unsaid. When at last the roof held, she busied herself with towels, while he sank back onto the cot, his face pale but eyes bright. One morning soon after, Clara walked a mile into town with Rose at her side. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow as he counted out her few coins. "Heard you've taken in a man," he said, not unkindly but with curiosity that bit deeper than malice. Clara's cheeks burned. She gave no reply, only gathered her goods and hurried out, Rose clutching her skirts. The weight of their life felt heavier than ever. Not only the hunger and the cold, but now the scorn of neighbors who had once looked at her with pity alone. Back at the cabin, Eli stood outside, leaning heavily on the fence, his eyes turned to the horizon. Clara approached slowly, half afraid he meant to leave. When he saw her, he gave the faintest smile, weary but genuine. "I ain't the man I seem," he said, his voice rough as gravel. She froze, Rose still clutching her hand. His eyes held a sadness she could not name, a sorrow deeper than wounds and fever. He did not explain further, not then, and she did not ask. The silence stretched between them, taut as wire, carrying questions that would not yet find answers. Clara looked at the children running toward the cabin, laughter echoing in the cooling air, and she realized the path ahead had grown darker even as the man at her fence grew stronger. He was no longer only a stranger clinging to life. He was a choice she had made, and choices have a way of remaking every road that follows. That night she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of rain dripping into the pot, her thoughts restless. She had opened her door to a man on the brink of death, and in doing so had invited something larger than she understood. Whatever truth he carried, it was bound her now. When dawn came, she rose with heavy eyes, watching the light spill across his sleeping face, and wondered if the world she had fought to keep intact was already slipping into something she could not yet name. The morning the riders came, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their hooves. Clara was tending the wash by the river, her hands raw in the cold water, when the sound reached her first. The rhythm of it was unmistakable. Not a lone traveler, but a company of men, horses galloping with purpose. She froze, suds dripping from her fingers, and turned toward the cabin. Eli was outside, standing unsteadily at the fence where he had taken to watching the horizon, and even from a distance she saw the change in his face. He knew those riders. The recognition hollowed his eyes, made his shoulders stiffen despite the wounds that had not fully healed. The children ran from the yard, their laughter turning shrill with nerves as the dust cloud swelled. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and moved quickly, instinctively gathering Tommy and Rose behind her. The riders slowed as they approached, dust settling over their coats, and at the front of them was a man who bore no softness in his expression. His mustache was silvered, his hat broad, his coat of fine leather stitched with wealth. He dismounted with the heavy grace of a man who had spent his life in command. His eyes swept the cabin, the children, and finally found Eli. "Boy," he said, his voice cutting to the still air like the crack of a whip. Eli did not answer right away. He gripped the fence rail, his knuckles white, and Clara saw the tremor in his hands. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. "Pa." The name landed like a stone in the silence. Clara's breath caught. So this was no ordinary drifter, no nameless man saved from the dirt. He had a father, and not just any father, a man whose very presence declared power. Jedediah Prescott. The name carried weight even in the town, spoken with envy and resentment alike. He owned more land than a man could ride in a week, more cattle than could be counted without losing daylight. To Clara, who had measured her worth in bread crusts and candle stubs, the sight of him was staggering. He looked at her, at the cabin sagging on its frame, and she felt herself shrink beneath the scrutiny. "You've gone and you're killed yourself," Jedediah said to Eli, though his gaze flicked again toward Clara. "And for what? To waste away in a hovel like this." Clara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Tommy clutched her skirts, and Rose's small hand curled into her palm. She stood straighter, willing herself to meet the man's stare. Eli's voice cracked as he answered, though it carried an edge Clara had not heard before. "It was here I found breath again. Here I wasn't left for dead." Jedediah's lip curled. He pulled a pouch from his coat, heavy with coin, and tossed it onto the porch steps. The clink of silver rang sharp in the air. "For her trouble. You've had your kindness. Boy, time to come home where you belong." Clara's face flushed hot. The children's eyes darted between her and the pouch as though it might explode. Slowly, she stepped forward, bent, and lifted it. For a moment, her fingers lingered on the drawstring. She could feel the weight of it, enough to keep her family warm and fed for months, maybe longer. Her breath shuddered. Then she walked to Jedediah and held it out. "I don't want your gold," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mercy don't carry a price." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. For the first time, surprise cracked the iron of his expression. Behind him, a few of the riders shifted, muttering under their breath. Eli's had lifted higher, strength sparking in his gaze. "You hear her, Pa?" he said, voice hardening. "She gave me more than all your cattle and coin ever did. She gave me a chance to be something other than your shadow." Jedediah stepped closer, towering, but Eli pushed in the fence and stood tall despite his weakness. Clara saw his legs tremble, yet he did not yield. His eyes blazed, his chest heaved, and in that moment he looked not like a broken man, but one remade. "You think I needed saving from the trail?" Eli continued, his words sharp, each one deliberate. "But I needed saving from myself. And she, this woman, these children, they did it by treating me like a man worth keeping alive." The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with more than just dust and breath. Jedediah stared at his son as though seeing him anew. The hardness in his gaze faltered, just barely, replaced by something unspoken, perhaps even ashamed. His glance shifted to Clara again, and though pride kept his mouth a thin line, his eyes softened with reluctant respect. He turned sharply, signaling to his men, "Mount up." His voice was gruff, but the command carried less fire than before. As he swung back onto his horse, he looked once more at Eli. "You got your choice then. Don't squander it." With that, the riders wheeled away, the thunder of hooves fading into the horizon, leaving only silence and the echo of decisions made. Eli sagged against the fence, drained, but Clara moved quickly to his side, steadying him with her hands. Their eyes met, and in the quiet between them something shifted, something neither dared to name, but both felt as sure as the earth beneath their feet. The children rushed forward, Tommy's eyes wide with wonder, Rose clinging to Eli's leg. "Mama," Tommy whispered, "does this mean we ain't poor no more?" Clara knelt, pulling both children close. She smoothed back Tommy's hair, kissed Rose's forehead, and let her gaze lift to Eli. He stood taller now, though pale, and she saw in his eyes not the weight of wealth, but the light of belonging. "We'll be what we've always been," Clara answered softly. "But maybe now we won't be alone." The fire crackled inside as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the cabin walls. Clara felt the ache of fear ease, replaced by a fragile hope. She had chosen mercy in the face of want, dignity in the face of shame, and in return she had been given something she had not dared to dream. Not riches, not status, but a chance to be seen, to be honored, to be part of something stronger than survival. Later that night, when the children slept and the cabin lay quiet, Eli sat by the hearth, the flames painting his face in amber and shadow. Clara joined him, her hands folded in her lap. They did not speak much, only small words, small nods, but the silence between them was full, brimming with what had been lost and what might yet be found. And if there was still gossip in town, if tongues still wagged at Clara Mae Whitfield's name, she let them. For within her home the air was warm, the children's laughter bright, and the stranger who had nearly died against her fence was no longer a burden, but a blessing. The prairie stretched endless outside, stars pricking the heavens, and in the hush of that vastness Clara felt her heart steady. Mercy had remade her world, and though the road ahead was uncertain, It gleamed with promise. In a land that measures worth by golden acres, the old voice of memory would someday say, "Remember, it was mercy that crowned the widow richest of all." For sometimes, the broken soul you shelter is the very hand of God, reaching back to lift you higher.